Wilderness Wetland. They've got the longest data record of a municipal wetland in Florida. The Green Cay Wetland is a large-scale groundwater recharge wetland in Palm Beach County, and we've been working to develop the design principles for this with Gainesville Regional Utilities for the last 4 years in Gainesville. Yes, ma'am?
How long does it take the process?
The water will be in the wetlands for just a matter of a few days, typically, up to a week or so. And so it's infiltrating. You're loading the water in like it's 24 inches deep or 18 inches deep, and it's going into the ground an inch a day or something like that. So it might be a week, it might be 2 weeks, but that very much affects how much treatment you get. And I'll come back to that. Next slide. So the Orlando system is 2 square miles, 1,200 acres. Has anybody been to the Orlando Easterly Wetlands? Good. I'm glad people in Orlando have been there. It's an incredible park, as you know. It started in 1987. It was designed at a time when we knew very little about treatment wetlands. And they over-designed it, which was great. It was originally designed for 20 million gallons a day, and it receives 30 million now. At least it has a design capacity or operational capacity. And they have a very state-of-the-art treatment plant at the Iron Bridge treatment plant that removes the total nitrogen down to 2.4 milligrams per liter before it goes into the wetland. Well, the wetland then takes the total nitrogen down to 0.8. And this is not just the nitrate nitrogen, this is also the organic nitrogen that's in that water. This is the lowest total nitrogen concentration that I've ever seen coming out of a treatment system. And the phosphorus goes down too. This system discharges to the St. Johns River, so it has very low standards for nitrogen and phosphorus. Next slide. These are the long-term data for the inflow from the treatment plant. The blue lines you see are in the range of 1/2 to like 2 parts per million for total nitrogen. That's coming out of an AWT wastewater treatment plant, like what Tallahassee is doing right now. And then the nitrate coming out of the wetland is the red line, and that's actually no, that's the total. No, these are the nitrate levels, yeah. The total nitrogen is 0.8 coming out of the wetland, but the nitrate itself is all essentially at background concentration. Wetlands will easily take nitrate if they have enough residence time down to 0.05, which is the background concentration in the aquifer. Next slide. They have a lot of visitors. It's probably somebody here in the room. And of course, they have a lot of wildlife out there. That's why people go out there. That alligator chasing a cattle egret up a palm tree is just a common sight out there. If you're a lucky photographer, that's from there. Next slide. The Green Cay wetlands. Anybody been to Green Cay? This is the most popular wildlife photography spot in Palm Beach County now. It's boardwalks. This is a nature center built on the edge of this treatment wetland. 70-acre treatment wetland. Receives 3 million gallons a day. That's an average infiltration rate after a period of, that's about 6 years or so now, 11 inches a week, which is a high recharge rate. And it has zero discharge, and they've got this boardwalk system that's just amazing. You're right with the wildlife. The wildlife is totally used to people and is tame. So these make wonderful parks. Next slide. They have up to 400,000 visitors a year to this, which is more than most of our state parks in Florida. Next slide. And then this little demonstration project we're doing in Gainesville, where we're actually refining Green Cay and Wakulla down in South Florida were not designed to get very low nitrate levels in the groundwater. That wasn't the way they were designed, but that's what we're perfecting in Gainesville now. This is one of the treatment marshes there. Next slide. There's actually, this is the wastewater treatment plant for Gainesville. It's called the Kanapaha Wastewater Treatment Plant. There's 3 cells that were constructed. The northern one, the second one, these are both wetland cells, and then a third cell, which was a rib cell. What we were doing is doing a direct experimental comparison between wetland cells and rib cells. Next slide. It's all operated remotely with a SCADA system. Next slide. And these are the nitrate levels in the surface water. The nitrate coming into the system is about 4 or 5 milligrams per liter. It's off this chart. These are the nitrate levels in the surface water and then in the groundwater in each of these 3 cells, comparing wetlands being loaded at 2 different loading rates. This is loaded at lower loading rates, you get lower nitrate levels. And actually what's in the ground is background. And then this one is getting from like 5 down to 1, and then it's getting to very low levels going into the ground. So even at quite high loading rates, you can get very low numbers below the 0.35 standard. And then the rib doesn't do as well. But even a rib, if you operate a rib poorly, it turns out it can get some denitrification. And a lot of people have found that out, and they've come up to me and they said, well, DEP won't let me operate it like that. And I said, well, that's too bad because it's working like a wetland. They said, yeah, I mean, nitrate levels are really low, but that's against the rules for ribs. You know, it's, where's the practicality? Next slide. So the process, you still need a wastewater treatment facility to treat the water to a good enough quality to go into the wetland, because you don't want to have poor habitat by putting really strong raw wastewater into it. And you construct a wetland for nitrification, denitrification, and then you've got to infiltrate the water. And so there's more than one way to design these. That's still being perfected. Next slide. And I'd like to talk about specifically the evaluation they asked me to do on Conserve site. Conserve facility shown in the red dots here. This is the overall groundwater shed that feeds the Wekiva River system. This is not just Wakulla Springs we're talking about. This is the whole Wekiva River, because there are springs all over the place feeding the Wekiva River. The total flow in the river is almost 195 million gallons a day. I mean, it's a lot of flow coming out of the river. Wakulla Springs is only about 50 to 70 CFS, but the whole river system puts out 300 CFS. It's a lot of water, and that's the size spring shed. It's almost 1,000 square miles that feeds that amount of water at about an average recharge rate of about 4.5 inches a year. The historic groundwater nitrate level of Wekiva Springs was less than 0.1 milligrams per liter, the only data we have from the 20s. Next slide. We have flow problems at Wekiva. This is a declining, these are annual averages of flow at Wekiva Springs over the period of record. And you can see the flow has declined from the 70 to 80 range down now to the less than 60 range. It's not in free fall, but the flow in Wekiva is coming down. It's not surprising. Orange County is pumping 250 million gallons a day. Polk County is pumping 250 million gallons a day on average. That's a lot of pumping going on here. Basically, you know, 500 million gallons a day is just being pumped in those two counties. Next slide. Nitrate levels are going up. The target from the PLURG study was 0.22 nitrate. Like I said, the state standard is 0.35, which is even higher. But these are the historic, we don't have any historic data points. This is Wekiva and Rock Springs. Some people said, oh, the levels in Wekiva are coming down. They're the red diamonds. It's really not sure. When you take annual averages, they pretty much have leveled off. And Rock Springs looks like it's leveled off too. So that's good. Maybe the loads aren't going up in the area because the levels aren't going up, but they're extremely elevated compared to what we'd like to see in Wekiva and Rock Springs. Next slide. So Conserve 2, what would it take? We just evaluated this one unit, Rib Site 6, in terms of converting it. But the total area of Conserve 2 is over 3,000 acres. The total permitted flow is 70 million gallons a day. 60% of that goes to reuse, mostly agricultural reuse, and 40% goes to recharge. That's about 15 million gallons a day of recharge. That recharge is carrying about 300 metric tons a year of elemental nitrogen to groundwater. It's going to groundwater. And Todd will talk about where that's going and how we don't know exactly where it's going. But the basins, there's 132 of them with 185 acres. And the permitted flow in the basins is twice what they're actually getting. So it can be increased in the future. Next slide. The study we did was just looking at the upper part of Rib Site 6. We basically, instead of using the rib cells, which are very small footprints, we just basically redesigned it as 3 wetland cells. And these cells are shown in green here, these green triangles and trapezoids. And basically, in wetland design, you put the water in, you have a deep water zone, which is those blue areas. You let the water then spread out from the deep water zone into a marsh. It goes through another deep water zone, which improves the hydraulics of the system in terms of sheet flow. And then it comes out to a deep zone and goes to these cells. The first cell would probably have to be amended. The soils would have to be amended so that the water would not all infiltrate. The infiltration rates are really high in these sandy soils. So you want to hold up the water long enough to get the nitrate out and then let it infiltrate in the final cells. And we estimated what you could get to at an average inflow concentration of 5.3, which is one period of record number. you could get down to like less than 0.25, which is essentially the TMDL for Wakulla Springs. And for about $10 to $15 million to convert for a total of 5 million gallons a day. So the whole system, if you did all 15 million gallons a day, it could be $30 to $45 million of additional cost to convert it. But then the operational cost is probably less than the ribs. Next slide. So groundwater recharge wetlands, you can tell I like them. I think they're a great idea. They're cost effective. The city and the county both have wetland systems. They're very familiar with wetlands. They haven't done this concept before. The Lake Martin project's closest to this. They have wetlands that recharge the ground and then feed Lake Martin. But this is an additional expense that would have to be incurred. But if you take that 300 metric tons a year, it's either going to Wakulla Springs and that Springs group, or it's going to people's wells. And would you rather drink it or rather have it go to the springs? Well, I would rather not have either. I'd rather have it taken out at a treatment plant that could enhance wetlands. Next slide. And can I answer a few questions? Or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yes, sir?
Yeah, Bob, Jim Adamski with Friends of Wekiva, and I've got
Oh, nice to see you, Jim.
well, good to talk to see you. I enjoyed your talk and everything, but I did have a number of questions. First of all, that map that you showed early on with
the spring shed?
Nitrate concentrations around
Oh, the state?
Where did you get those data?
We got them from all the water management districts and from the USGS. We mined every data set we could get. This was about...
Did you screen them for anything? I mean, just
No, but we just took the groundwater data, and so they could be different levels of the aquifer.
As I mentioned when I talked to you on the phone the other day, I sampled 34 wells about 10 years ago. I worked at the USGS, and only one of the wells in the upper Florida aquifer showed any nitrate concentration. That's included in the upper Florida well at Rock Springs and another one at Wakulla Springs State Park. So I'm just kind of a little puzzled by your data.
Well, I'd love for the USGS to do this. I tried to talk your agency, the FGS, and all the water management districts into doing that map for me. None of them would do it, so I just did it myself. I'm sure it can be improved. It has all the springs data in it as well.
A couple other things that I noticed. The monitoring well data that you showed around the ribs and spray fields, what aquifers did they tap?
Those are Florida aquifer.
Those were Florida?
Yeah.
Because I know a lot of
Those are in the unconfined areas of Alachua County.
around the chart that you showed, showing
The two graphs I showed, yeah, those are from ribs and spray fields in Alachua County.
well, I got the impression that they were from the ribs around Concert too.
Nope, I didn't say. I said Alachua County.
Oh, okay. My mistake. Okay.
The ones at Conserve 2 look just like that.
Yeah.
I've looked at the groundwater data, and they are very elevated.
The ones in the superficial aquifer are.
And some of the Floridan wells are also, Jim.
Some of the Florida.
Yeah, well, there's enough of them to indicate to me that that's the real situation in the Floridan aquifer too, and that's the conclusion in several of the papers I've read.
Well, one thing to point out to the folks here is that there's a completely different geology between what's happening up in Alachua and what's happening down here. Down here we have 50 to 100 feet of a very thick clay layer called the intermediate confining unit that separates the superficial aquifer from the other Florida aquifer. And so that's why you might expect to see higher stuff up in Alachua. And finally, question. Your chart showing the, I'm sorry, I'm monopolizing. Your chart showing the nitrate concentrations in Wekiva and Rock Springs. High elevated nitrate, from what I can see, dating all the way back to
Can you go back up, Todd?
1982.
Actually, the only point in the 70s is right there, and then there's really not much data until after 86 when the ribs came on site. So you can't see a response there for sure to the ribs, but those are the St. Johns River Water Management District data that they publish.
I point that out, that the ribs came on in 1986, I believe. And,
right. Right, and those numbers are after that.
And what is the distance between the ribs and the springs? What, 17 miles?
Thank you. Any other questions?
Wait, what group were you with? Sorry.
Well, I'm a professor at Valencia College, professor of geology, with one of the directors of Canada.
Okay, you're here to help with the solution as well, though, right? Because
Exactly.
you sounded a little bit argumentative. That's why I'm wondering.
I'm sorry, I don't mean mean it's argumentative. I'm just.
Otherwise, that might be another conversation, but I think everybody here today we're all trying to figure out how we can help. As long as you're on the same, I just wanted to know your background. I want to know what your agenda was.
Well, I mean, I very much agree with Dr. Knight that something needs to be done with the spring. Whether the conserves too is the issue. I would have a disagreement on that.
Okay. I just wanted to know where everybody stood. Just, wondering who's in the room.
And I've studied Wekiva Springs for, well...
Do we have time for any more questions? Chuck, or we need to get going?
We're going to have a question and answer period at the end of Dr. Kincaid's presentation. Well, he's going to...
Thank you.
Jim, I'm glad you brought up that last point. You said that
This is already turned on. Click on the bell.
geology in West Orange County is different for some reason than the rest of the state. Okay? Dr. Kincaid is a native Floridian, and he started out diving in the caves in Wekiva Springs. So he was one of those kids that held his breath and went down through the crack to see how far he could go. He was telling us last night over beers that he would turn sideways to get through a crack.
Don't spoil it for me.
I killed your punchline. To see how far back in while he was holding his breath. Okay, so that kind of daredevil attitude.
Better to be lucky than good.
Led him to a bachelor's and a master's in geology and hydrogeology, and also a PhD in hydrogeology. He's been all over the world: Turkey, China, Mexico, diving in underwater caves. He is an expert in hydrology. He's done nitrate studies in the state of Florida, particularly in Wakulla Springs. So, if we're talking about the distance between Water Conserve 2 and Wakulla Springs, and it's 18 miles, and oh my goodness, it's going to take 105 years. Dr. Kincaid has flown in from Nevada to talk about how long does it take for that water to go from Water Conserve to Wakulla Springs? How long does that take? How long does it take for water to travel underground? There's no better expert on that matter than Dr. Kincaid. As a matter of fact, he has flown across country to come here to tell us why we don't need his services. I don't think you get too many scientists that will fly across country to tell you why he doesn't need to be hired. He says over and over again, every time a municipality says, oh, it takes decades for water to go from point A to point B. As in Wakulla Springs, it turns out to take 66 days. So the point of the talk here is nothing more than let's find out how long it takes the water to get there and where it goes. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Todd Kincaid.
Thanks, Chuck. Thanks, Chuck. I hope I can live up to that glowing introduction. So I'm not sure I can do that, but I'm going to do something a little different today. Usually I do like Bob did and jump right into my graphs and charts and figures and numbers. But today I thought, since I'm actually from Orlando, I grew up not far from here. And when I turned the corner, I saw Howard Middle School. I was a wrestler in junior high school, and Howard was the only, Bo Diddley was the only guy that beat me when I was in 9th grade. So, so I was. It's a lot like coming home. Because of that, I am going to subject you guys to a story, and that's kind of how I wanted to start out. And hopefully, the story will shed a little bit of light on why I'm coming here to talk to you today. But as I said, I grew up in Orlando, and one of my first memory with Wekiva Springs was when I was about 12 or 13 years old. My mom dropped two of my friends and I off at the Wekiva Marina and pushed us off downriver in a canoe for a 3-day camping trip on our own. So we took off and we paddled down the river. We camped on low islands. I don't know how many of you have paddled down. About 6 miles down, you start to see a few little low islands. I actually don't know if they're still there or not. I assume they are. They're about a foot off the ground, and we camped on those little islands. We set trot lines in the river, caught catfish with mussels that we collected off of the sand bottom, and we cooked them up on fires and ran around at night with burning. Anybody ever lit one of the dead palm leaves on fire? It makes a really nice torch. Well, we 3 12-year-olds running around on our own on the island. We had a good time. I'm glad it didn't burn down. We saw baby alligators and their mothers nested amongst the water lilies. We saw more birds and turtles and water bugs than I can remember being able to count. We laid at night listening to the noises and trying to convince ourselves that they weren't monsters vying to eat us. And as you might imagine, it was a pretty fantastic experience for us. We had a great 3 days, and we got back in time to not make anybody mad. But what was interesting, looking back on that, is that, on that last day, the experience that we had really wasn't very different than what we were used to. I mean, we grew up here in Florida, and back in the late 1970s and the early 80s, I'm sure it's not too different today, but the Little Econ. I lived right behind Lake Barton, so I lived just down the street from Little Lake Barton behind the Herndon Airport. They were teeming with life. We saw alligators all the time. We saw birds everywhere we went. Even Lake Underhill, which I have had the, no offense to anybody, displeasure of going back to visit. It's a little bit more crowded than I remember it. But nothing was really unique. What was unique was the spring. When I went to Wekiva Springs that day, and we all went out to the spring and we hung out with the other little kids, hanging out at the vent, looking down, it was the most wondrous thing I'd ever seen. Because here in front of me was this amazing amount of water just blowing out of the ground. And that was something that was totally different to my experience, because it's not like a fire hydrant. How many of you ever ran around playing in the water at the fire hydrant? It's really fun. But you could see there was a valve, there were hoses, you could tell where does the water come from. But for me, staring at those springs, I didn't know where the water came from. And it's just sparked the imagination. And unlike Wekiva Falls, how many, if anybody, I don't even know if it's still, the falls are still flowing, but they're really not falls, right? They're a well. And even as a 12-year-old, you could see that, oh, this is a well, and this is a man-made feature. And you could envision, it didn't, but you could envision valves and things like that. But the springs were different. But I was captivated by that force, and as Chuck said, I became one of the kids that would hold my breath and swim as far down into it as I could possibly get. And ultimately, I learned that I learned, number one, that kids tell lies. So you really can't. I know, it's amazing. It was a revelation. But I would sit and listen to the older kids tell me how they could hold their breath and swim from the main vent over to the side vent underneath the lifeguard. And I swear to you, I stuck myself in every one of those holes about as far as I could possibly get, trying to be just like those kids. And I could never get far enough. So ultimately, I went over that side hole and found that if I turned my head sideways and exhaled a little so my chest compressed, I could pull myself in the crack, which is about a 10-foot long bedding plane. You can pull yourself in until, boom, you pop out in a room on the other side. How many of you know there's a little room on the other side of that 10-foot crack? There's a little room. It's about the size of this room here. And after about 50 tries, I got good enough to hold my breath so I could swim across the other side of the room. And that was a well trove of shark's teeth. Because basically all the sand, for the geologists in the room, think about this, there's sand coming out of the limestone vent, right? So where does that sand come from? It's being transported in from above. So the sand is being blown through this cave system, and then as it empties into this bigger room, it falls down, and the big particles collect at the bottom, and so you could go and collect those shark's teeth and bring them out. And I made some ground with the other kids with the shark's teeth, you know. But still, all I could see was that the cave kept going, and I regret to say I didn't have the courage to keep holding my breath and go further into that cave. So, but what I did do is I came back when I was 18 years old, and I disguised my scuba gear as a raft, and I floated that little raft in right beneath the lifeguard chair. And when the lifeguard was distracted by some of the commotion that you could always count on taking place in the basin, I sank the raft and I shoved it into the little crack. And then I came back up and swam around, demonstrated properly to the lifeguard that I was swimming away. And then when she wasn't looking again, I held my breath and I swam along the bottom, back to the crack, pushed myself in, shoved the gear in, and I put my gear on inside that little room, and that's where I made my first cave dive. So I swam into that hole, and I followed the cave probably about 100 feet, you know, corner after corner, checking it out with my little flashlight in a Ziploc bag. That's a one-trick wonder, by the way. Corner after corner until finally it just kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and then the more I'd wriggle, finally I'm like, you know what? I need to turn around. I think those kids were lying to me. I don't think this thing is going to come out at that other vent. And then it occurred to me, too, that I'd already tried to fit into the holes on the other side, and I couldn't get out. So even if I could find my way out, I probably wasn't going to be able to get out of it. So I found a way to turn around and proceeded to get stuck. And I got stuck really hard and fast. And why, might you ask, did I get stuck? Well, because the cave is small, obviously, but also because Wakulla Springs was blowing out, you know, an enormous amount of water. And as I'm taking up that restriction, right, what happens to the velocity? Now I've been to enough school to know that, you know, as the size of the passage shrinks, the velocity goes up. So the velocity got really fast, and it shoved me into the wedge of the rock. And I was wedged really good. I could feel the belt, my belt buckle on my gear jammed against rock on the floor, and I could feel the tank valve on my back jammed against rock on the front. And the more I wriggled and squeezed and tried to get out, you know, the more the sand kicked up in my face, and then ultimately I couldn't really see anything any longer either. So I don't actually need this anymore. I can kind of tell it by memory. But luckily for me, I did the only one thing that anybody can do to save their life at that point, which is I calmed down. And I got nice and calm, and I just started breathing. And I was able to wriggle my arm between my chest and the rock and keep squeezing it a little at a time. Take it, breathe in, and you can get it a little further down until finally I could release my belt buckle. And then when I released that belt buckle, you ever shot a pea between your fingers? And that's about exactly what it was like. When that belt buckle let go, I shot out of that hole, you know, into another little room, just about like a pea being shot between your fingers. The next thing I know, I couldn't really see anything because I'd blown all the sand up in my face. So next thing I know, I was stuck in this room, another room, you know, where I jammed into a wall. But here I knew that I could float around, and I knew I was out of the restriction. So I sat and I waited, and eventually the sand settled, visibility came back, and I swam out into the room, took my gear off, shoved it into my little disguise raft, and swam out to the light. And I am lucky to have made it through my first cave dive. But now, I'd like to be able to say I was smart enough never to do that again. But instead, I immediately went out and I scrounged together all the dollars I could get, and I went to every yard sale I could find. I bought myself what was actually a fairly legitimate set of cave diving equipment. And from that point on, I was totally fixated. So it wasn't too long before I was making about 4 cave dives a week. And and I did that all the way through my college career at the University of Florida. So, you know, I add to it, I got a little list, you know, just some of the ones I can remember, but, you know, we went to all kinds of springs. I mean, you know, Volusia Blue, of course, is, you know, one of the close ones. Crystal River, Juniper, Jenny, Madison, Madison Blue, Jackson Blue, Peacock, Manatee, Royal, Bathtub, Cal, Troy, Itchituckney, Blue Hole, Little River, Wakulla, and there's a lot more than that. Let's see, we started diving, doing some cave dives and chasing further and further back into the caves. Let's see, catch my spot. Devil's Ear, my home turf when I went up to University of Florida. Devil's Ear is on the Santa Fe River right outside of Ginnie Springs. About 4 days a week we were diving at 3/4 of a mile into Devil's Ear and back. That was our normal dive, was about 3/4 of a mile depending on which tunnel we wanted to take. Whenever we'd leave Devil's Ear, we'd go over to Little River, Telford, Peacock, and push those caves for about a mile each. Madison Blue was where I personally got infatuated, and I was lucky to explore the back reaches of Madison to about 1.5 miles, and then ultimately my partner and I set the North American record for the longest cave dive in North America, obviously at 2 miles in Manatee Springs. So somewhere along the line. We were also chasing the depth, the demon of the depth as well. So Little River is 120 feet, Thunder Hole 150, Peacock and Orange Grove 180, Alachua 200, Dive Holder number 2 whopping 355 feet. That was the big one that we did. So we weren't the only ones exploring caves, obviously. A former friend and colleague of mine, Wes Skiles, was one of the active explorers at the time exploring the Wakulla cave system. And his real passion, though, was to take video cameras with him and to capture that on film. And he became widely known as one of the most accomplished underwater cinematographers in the world. And he made a documentary called Water's Journey. And if you haven't seen that documentary, I highly recommend it. You can order it on Amazon.com. I wish that Wes could continue to be with us today, but alas, he's not here any longer. Somewhere about that time, I stumbled into a geology course at the University of Florida as an undergraduate, and I learned about groundwater, and I learned that I decided to change my major away from civil engineering and dedicate my career to studying groundwater science. And so with that long story, I appreciate you bearing with me, but the next 30 minutes I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about what I've learned in the 20 years since then. So with that, I'm going to start the presentation. Thanks, Bob. So keep on scrolling through. These were, I don't know why I did this, but this is obviously Wekiva. Just keep on clicking until you get to a reel. Keep on going. It won't look like you're doing anything. Yeah, it is. There we go. All right, so the first thing I learned when I got to hydrogeology class was that there are no such thing as underground rivers. You know, a point that continues to get beaten into my head, even though I refuse any longer to accept it. These are the things, the tenets. Groundwater flows through the spaces between the rock grains, and if you take a look at the diagrams, I'm trying to illustrate that. I learned that groundwater flow is a diffuse and slow process. I learned that velocities tend to be on the order of feet per year, or sometimes even less. And I learned that the mathematical concepts that we were taught, they evolved out of a sandstone aquifer, the great sandstone aquifer of the Midwest, the Ogallala Aquifer. And that by mastering these concepts, it renders the aquifer storage and contaminant movement and groundwater movement to be very predictable phenomena. And the other thing I was told is that amateurs study springs and professionals study wells. Okay, so these are the things that I learned in my first class. They didn't sit really well with me, given that 4 days a week I was diving in these caves and feeling flow blowing so fast that if I stopped kicking it would shoot me out the other end. at a rate quite a bit faster than feet per year, I can assure you. But some other things that I learned that did really resonate is that water flows down gradient. It always flows down gradient, no matter where you are, no matter what rock you're in. Inflows always equal outflows. But then in terms of the hydrologic cycle, this is sort of the concept that we're taught, is that you have rain that infiltrates the ground, and the infiltration accumulates in the aquifer, and then the water flows through this diffuse process on its path to rivers and streams and ultimately the ocean. And that the aquifer itself, even though groundwater flows very slowly, can have an enormous amount of storage. Okay, so the next slide. This, however, is a little bit more close to how I saw it, which is pretty much the same thing. Water still flows down gradient, even in karst. Always flows down gradient. Inflows still equal outflows. But groundwater is a fast convergent flow process. And two important things to realize here is that the difference between these two models, and that's what all of this really boils down to, is a model of how we think the world works, is that in the karst system, groundwater flows really fast, and there's a lot less storage. So there's a lot less water in the aquifer, and it moves through the aquifer a hell of a lot faster. Excuse my language. Okay, so here's what the difference is between these two models. Now here what I'm doing is I'm simulating a river. You know, this line represents a river, and there's two springs on the river. In the diffuse flow model, basically what it says is groundwater flows diffusely, meaning evenly and slowly through the aquifer, and it converges onto the river, and that the river gains. Here I've got my measuring stations. It's 100 CFS upstream and 200 CFS downstream. So it picks up 100 CFS. It's a gaining stream from the groundwater discharge. And that gain is occurring all along evenly across the reach of the river. Of course, if you spend any time on Florida rivers, you realize that that's not really what it looks like, right? You paddle along the river, and then you see a spring. And so it might gain exactly that 100 CFS, but instead of it gaining it evenly across the reach of the river, it gains it at, in this case, 2 discrete points at the 2 springs. And you can see the pickup, you know, with your own eyes as you paddle down the river. And the difference here is that this one, there must be convergent flow in order for this to be true. There must be conduits that connect to those springs. And those conduits must collect water from an upland recharge area and then convey it to the springs. So that's the difference. And this is what it would look like if I rendered this in 3 dimensions. This is just a hypothetical image here. We have a conduit. This block represents the water table, or the potentiometric surface. It represents the aquifer, the part of the aquifer that's got water in it. And what the conduits do is they create troughs, like canyons. How many people have ever, you know, hiked through a canyon? All the water drains into the canyon, and then the canyon picks up the water and delivers it out the other end. And that's exactly what's happening in the aquifer because of these conduits. Okay, so next slide. So this is kind of what the models break out. You know, we kind of get a little more technical, but now, really, as a scientist or as an engineer, our challenge is to take these models of the world and then do something useful with them, right? To be able to make predictions or to help guide people in their decision-making processes. Well, we use math to do that. And as it turns out, it's a hell of a lot easier to write and solve the equations for this model of the world than it is for either this model or that model of the world. Now, you ever hear the joke about losing your glasses, and the man's looking on the ground for his glasses, and the other person comes up and says, "You lost your glasses. Where'd you lose them?" "Oh, I lost them in the other room." I'm like, "Well, why are you looking in this room?" "Because it's light in this room. It's dark in the other room. I can't see." I'm like, well, that's kind of where we're at. Basically, in the early 1970s, as we started to evolve in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, all the way into the 70s, as we started to evolve our knowledge of groundwater flow systems, both karst and porous media, the limitations on our ability to compute the mathematics behind them drove us to this model out of necessity. But for the last 20 years, we have not been here as a form of necessity. We can quite readily, and there is software available right off the shelf to help us deal with either this model or with the model of conduits. But what I'm going to talk about is the consequence of us being firmly rooted in the estimation or the assumption that the Floridan aquifer is this porous media, this sand model. Next. So this is what the Floridan aquifer looks like. And to the point that was brought up earlier, there is differences in the aquifer. This map shows the confinement in the Floridan aquifer. This region in the lightest area we call the karst belt. It's where the aquifer is unconfined. So basically it means that there's literally nothing of substance that impedes recharge from occurring directly to the Floridan aquifer anywhere where this light area is occurring. And all these black dots are first magnitude springs, meaning that they discharge more than 100 CFS. And all these white dots are second magnitude springs, second mag springs, which means they discharge somewhere between 10 and 100 CFS. And you can see that the concentration of these is pretty highly favored into the unconfined region, but it's not all in the unconfined region. All of these springs are discharges from the Floridan. The darker areas are where the Floridan becomes progressively covered by thicker and thicker amounts of confining material. And what that confining material does is it impedes recharge. So you can pretty easily look on a map and you can think about where you are today. The fact that there are all these streams and lakes and everything else in the Orlando region is only because you're on the confined material. Because the water, it doesn't recharge rapidly through that material and get into the Floridan aquifer. Okay, so that's what the confinement does. So there's three areas that I'm going to kind of refer to today. Actually, 4 areas, but most of the time I'm going to talk about the Wakulla Springs area, which is up here in the Big Bend, south of Tallahassee. I've been studying the Wakulla area for probably 13 years with the Florida Geological Survey. We chose Wakulla for a specific reason. The idea is that, you know what, the idea of, the great thing about science is that you hold one or a couple things true, is that if you can understand processes, then those processes become more broadly applicable to other regions, right? So instead of studying individual things all over the state, we decided to focus intently on one area and study it to death so that we could identify how it works, identify methodologies that are useful for the characterization of that type of hydrogeologic environment, the karst hydrogeologic environment in Florida. So that's why we studied in Wakulla. I'm going to talk a little bit about this area on the Santa Fe and Swanee River. This is the Silver Springs area. I got a slide on that. And then, of course, this is where we are over here on this marginally confined part of the aquifer. Right in the what we're talking about is a collection of second magnitude springs that discharge out to the Wekiva River. Next. Okay, so this is Wakulla. This is it's a big spring, 120 to 1500 CFS, depending on what day you measure it. So that's somewhere between on average 250 million gallons a day, and it peaks out at over 1 billion gallons of water per day. It creates the headwaters of the Wakulla River. Glass bottom boat tours probably won't be able to ride those very much longer because the clarity of the spring is disappearing. But if you haven't been to Wakulla, I highly recommend a vacation to go up to Wakulla Springs. Yeah?
Sorry, the acronym again, CFS stands for?
Cubic feet per second. So yeah, not a problem. So it's about, I don't know, about how many heads per second. All right, next. All right, so can you move your mouse and click on this part of the black? Click. And click on that part on the other corner. Awesome. Thanks, Bob. All right, I thought I'd let you, it's only going to show one at a time. Well, let's look at one at a time. I thought I'd just let you see a little bit about what these caves look like. These are caves from the Wakulla cave system, as I was saying. This is actually, I stole this from a video that was made by for Japanese public television. But this is the part that's really cool. How many people have seen it, The Abyss? Anybody ever see the movie Abyss? Well, they use the same technology to show you what the caves look like. Oh, sorry. Click on the other one really quick. This is a good one. We got enough of that one. Okay. Keep clicking on it. Why is it stopping?
What's that fall?
Those are divers. Yep, so now they're entering into the cave system, and this will give you a little sense of what the caves look like. Now, Wakulla, I'm not here to tell you that Wekiva is like Wakulla. Remember I told you at the beginning I was barely able to squeeze through the passages of Wekiva. Wakulla is the longest underwater cave in North America, and it is some of the largest cave passages, underwater cave passages that have been observed anywhere in the world. But what I will tell you is that the processes are the same in terms of the capacity of those conduits to transmit water relative to the capacity of the rock around it to transmit flow. And go back to a little story. When I was an undergraduate, I of course was diving every day, and they were teaching us that there's no such thing as underground rivers. And we had my professor Dan Spangler invited Wes Skiles to come to our classroom, and I didn't admit to many of people at University of Florida that I was a cave diver, so I kind of tried to keep that under wraps. But when Wes came, he showed videos of the caves that I was diving in, and everybody was really impressed and blown away. And Dr. Spangler appropriately pointed out that karst was described in our textbook. It accounted for the one paragraph of the one chapter in our textbook that said basically that everything else in this textbook is not relevant to karst environments. Okay, so that was the one paragraph on karst. A little while after that, one of the professionals from Swanee River Water Management District also came to our class. And though I regret to say I didn't have the courage to challenge people on the differences between what we were being taught and what I was seeing in the caves, one of my classmates did. And they asked the professional, "What's going on?" You know, basically he came and he was telling us about how all of these methodologies, you know, for characterization of the aquifer are duly applied in the management of groundwater resources. And one of the questions was, well, how are these methodologies, you know, how do you deal with karst in the presence of caves in the Swanee River Basin? And he said, well, caves really don't exist. And so the student said, well, we just saw the video from Wes Skiles. And he said, Wes Skiles fabricated all of that stuff because he's a Hollywood guy. They really don't exist, or if they do exist, they're just anomalies that are irrelevant. So in other words, you don't have to worry about them. Just continue to focus on the porous media theory that you're being taught, and everything will be fine. So that's kind of where we're and to me, I think that's largely why we are where we are today. So this is now Wakulla, unfortunately. It's pretty overgrown with algae and a massive hydrilla problem. Next slide. As you know, Bob showed you. You know, he took care of the whole state here. But this is you know, ad nauseum. Any spring you go to, you see that you have early levels where nitrates are really low, and then as you move into the more recent decades, nitrates are up. You know, in this case at Wakulla, they peaked out at above 1 and started to stabilize somewhere between 0.8 and 1 milligram per liter. You know, lots of studies identifying sources. Sources were septic systems, wastewater treatment, fertilizers. Sounds familiar, right? So industry. Move on to the next level. So the question was, you know, well, what is the hydrogeology and you know, what do we know about the system so that we can identify, we can narrow down those sources, and we can identify the bad guy so that we can, you know, make the bad guy pay, so to speak. And that's, you know, sort of to be the recurring theme. So here's what was known about the Woodville karst plain where the Wakulla sits in and around 1990. So basically the why I've dated it is because these blue lines here were the mapped caves that had been mapped by the Woodville karst plain project divers. So this is the Leon Sinks cave system. This is Chip's Hole. This is Indian Springs, and this is the small Wakulla cave system as it was mapped in and about 1990. All these brown lines are rivers that disappear at places that we call swallets, where they go completely underground. And so you have Lost Creek, Jump Creek, Black Creek, Fisher Creek. This is the Munson Slough that takes about 60% of the city of Tallahassee's stormwater, comes through Lake Munson, and then ultimately goes underground here at these swallets called Ames Sink. And over here, I don't have the center pivots on them, but this is where the city of Tallahassee spray field is located. So what do we know? We know from wells that water always flows down gradient, and flow is converging from the north, from the west, from the east, and it's flowing into this big trough here that is called the Woodville Karst Plain. This is where all of these springs are located, and then ultimately flows out the Wakulla River to the Gulf of Mexico. Wakulla Springs, the third largest spring in the state, like I said, average discharge about 250 million gallons a day. Spring Creek, formerly listed in the books as the largest spring in Florida, probably a comparable discharge, but people estimated that it might be twice or 3 times more flow as Wakulla. And then St. Mark's River Rise, again, a comparable discharge to Wakulla in terms of magnitude. So you have these 3 major spring discharges that are just emitting rivers of water into the Gulf. And then, of course, all these other stars are second magnitude springs, some comparable to Wekiva, most of them quite a bit smaller. So what we also knew is that we had done age dating studies that had labeled the Wakulla Springs water at being 40 years old. Right there, that was a key point of scientific data. Sprayfield went in about 1980. And this was about 2000 when we were having this discussion. The water at Wakulla Springs is 40 years old. So what's the conclusion? If the water's 40 years old, how can the nitrate at Wakulla possibly be coming from the spray field? Because the nitrate at Wakulla must ergo to be at least 40 years old, right? So we have these age dates. We also have groundwater models that suggest that flow is around 0.1 to at most 25 feet per day. So again, you look at it, this distance is 12 miles, 0.1 feet per day. Gives you an idea that the spray field is a really long way away. It's not a high source of water. Now, note one thing. These lines are what we call the potentiometric surface, and they essentially, the lines on the outside are the high lines. So this is the canyon that I showed you in that earlier image, okay? And this is the flanks of the canyon. All the water is flowing in. If you look at the potentiometric surface, the spray field is here. The gradient is here. So there is a pathway, and that was duly noted by the Northwest Florida Water Management District. But nonetheless, what people keyed into was the 40-year age, the travel times, and the relative proximity of Wakulla to the spray field versus St. Mark's to the spray field. And so the dominant thinking at the time was that the nitrate at the spray field was going to St. Mark's, not to Wakulla, okay? So next slide. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a series of scientific investigations that we did, groundwater tracing experiments that we did in the basin to try to better understand the flow paths to Wakulla Springs, to maybe learn more than what we could learn simply from the age dates and the potentiometric surface maps. So we engaged in this, remember I'm the guy that kept diving after I got pinned, right? So I'm not the smart, brightest bulb in the box. That's why I like to key into things like groundwater tracing. It's pretty idiot-proof. You put something in the water, and then you go, and if you find it someplace else, whoo, I've got a connection. And I can measure the distance. Well, when we first came in, when I first showed up in 2000, and I got together with Rodney DeHaan at Florida Geological Survey, and we talked about what we wanted to do, the powers that be didn't want to hear anything about tracing work. We didn't want to hear anything about tracing to Wakulla Springs because it was believed it would be impossible because Wakulla was too big of a flow. In other words, if you put some dye in the ground, it's going to be so diluted with the flow at Wakulla Springs that you're never going to see it. By the way, a dye tracer test had been done maybe 20 years ago where they put some dye in at Ames Sink, the sink that takes the discharge water from the city of Tallahassee, And they didn't see it at any of the wells that they tested around there. I wanted to point out that they didn't bother to look at Wakulla Springs, but nonetheless, nobody looked, so they didn't find, the tracer test didn't work. Anyway, we know that, we also know that, of course, there are no such thing as underground rivers, and nobody was paying attention to this suspicious thing that looks like an underground river. So we wanted to go in and do some tracing. So the very first trace that we did, I proposed, well, we're going to put some dye into one sinkhole, and we're going to measure it at another one. And I was pretty sure it would get there because I'd already swam that distance, okay? So I loaded that shotgun to make sure that I would win a successful trace. So go ahead and click through this, Bob. So that was it, and it was Sullivan Sink to Sherrill Sink, 1.6 miles, traveled 8,800 feet per day. And I said, oh, wow, look, we're successful there. We might as well go over here to Fisher Creek, and maybe we can see where it goes. And lo and behold, Fisher Creek 2 travels at about 3,700 feet per day. We did it at Black Creek, and this time, same thing, about 2,600 feet per day. And this one was interesting. Don't go any further than that. But at Black Creek, I kind of, again, loaded the shotgun. We put some extra sampling stations further down in the cave system, and we saw, hey, this little bit of dye that we put at Black Creek keeps on going, and it heads suspiciously toward Wakulla Springs. And we could track it all along its path. The other thing that we learned is at the same time we were doing a collaborative study with some age daters, and I asked them to age date Sherrill Sink, and the age date came back at 35 years. So not wanting to be too much of a smart ass, I said, okay, well, if the travel time is what we get from the tracer test, and presuming that this is a continuous process, with a porous media aquifer, then this water must be coming from 21,000 miles away. Because you told me how old it is, and I'm telling you how fast it's going, and the only way to rectify those two is to tell you that it came from right about here, but instead of coming here directly, it went around the world. So with that one, I was actually able to get some more funding to do yet another trace. And we went ahead, we step out a little bit further. These are the traces I just told you about. By 2005, the divers, my buddies in the Woodville Cars Plane Project had done a lot more diving, a bunch more exploration in Indian, really explored a lot of cave in Wakulla. So now it's, if you look, Wakulla is getting close to being about the same size cave system as Leon Sinks. This is 11 miles, so you're talking about many miles of mapped cave passage by this time. Okay, so now go ahead and do this. We're going to do some more tracing. We injected at the same point in the cave system where we got the detection from Black Creek and Fisher Creek, and we tracked it all the way through this cave through many sinkholes. We had drilled a well into Wakulla, and we saw it come out at Wakulla, and then eventually, so we know it came into the cave system down here and then turned and flowed north back up to the spring. The bottom line is it traveled 10.3 miles, 7 days. The velocity there is over 1.5 miles per day. So with this one in mind, they asked us finally to say, okay, why don't you guys trace Ames Sink? This is 60% of the city of Tallahassee stormwater runoff. Let's go ahead and trace it. We did one of the sinkholes, Kelly Sink, traveled to Indian Springs, 5.2 miles, 13 days, about 2,000 feet per day. The next one we did from Ames Sink itself to Indian Spring as well, 5.2 miles, 17 days, 1,600 feet per day. So we went ahead and did a trace from Indian, saw that it connected into the Leon Sinks cave system and then flowed down, makes the loop to Wakulla, and we get 5.5 miles, 5.9 days, about 5,000 feet per day. So the bottom line is whatever goes into Ames Sink is going to show up at Wakulla Springs approximately 2 weeks later. That's the takeaway message. So whatever is on Tallahassee streets, you're swimming in at Wakulla 2 weeks after that. Okay? So next slide. So the big question then became pretty quickly, wow, if you guys can do all this with dye tracing, what about the spray field? Well, what's in between here? There are no conduits. The spray field is up on the margin of the confining unit. Depending on where you are in the spray field, you're literally on the toe of the clay. So in some places there's confinement, other places there isn't. spray field was chosen, of course, for high infiltration rates, so it's real close to that edge. But there are no mapped conduits. No matter how many holes my friends climbed into, sinkholes out here, they couldn't find any caves going towards the spray field. So it was a big difference, instead of tracing through known caves or from known swalettes, we're going to be tracing from the spray field. But here, the purpose is, of course, to say, does it go to Wakulla? Does it go to St. Mark's? Next. This is what the spray field looks like. Two things to point out. These are the ones that we talk about because we're hydrogeologists. There's all this water flowing onto the ground and it's infiltrating quickly. These plants aren't taking it up fast enough. Of course, they actually found out at the spray field that they had to add fertilizer in order to grow anything because the infiltration rate was just too high. So they added fertilizer, they added cows to try to make this an economically viable farm, basically, was what their goal was. So the other thing, though, to note is that there's all these cows wandering around the field. I'm the hydrogeologist. I didn't pay attention to the living things. Next. And I'll tell you why that becomes relevant soon. But this is what dye tracing looks like. Basically, you get a whole bunch of, I call it the witch's brew. If you put your hand in this, it will turn color. So you can trust me, or one day you can test it. I, of course, had to test it. Yeah.
Field water from fertilizer runoff, or is that because
this is the city's treated wastewater effluent? So it goes through secondary treatment, and so now it is technically drinkable water, I think.
About 8 to 10 milligrams per liter at that point.
And it's about 8 to 10 milligrams per liter nitrate at this point.
it's due to human waste? That has nothing to do with Big Ag. That's us.
No, this is us. All this stuff coming down is us. Well, not us because we're not in Tallahassee, but you get the idea.
It's humans, I'm saying. It's not from eating
Right.
cattle.
No, this is just wastewater effluent, and what they found was that the 8 to 10 milligram per liter nitrate in the effluent was not enough fertilizer to sustain an economical crop. So they had to then augment that with additional fertilizer in order to grow anything at the spray field.
At a rate of about 300 pounds per acre per year.
Yeah, well, the way I like to look at it is that, again, a hydrogeologist, what you're seeing here, on the operation on a whole equates to about 400 inches of rain a year. Okay, so here we get, about 50 inches of rain, I'm guessing? It's pretty good. So it's a lot more rain than you normally get. Okay, go to the next slide. And this is what it looks like. It's really pretty rocket science. You just take all these pails, you pour them in that stream, or you pour them in the bucket, you pour it down the well. What we didn't count on is that these guys tore up all of our equipment all the time. So every time we leave it alone, the cows would come and smash it down, I think just because they really hated us. But so I ended up building fences for 3 weeks with my buddy Gareth here. So we laughed. We were like, wow, between the two of us, we got about 20 years of graduate school, and we're building, fences that are actually probably pretty poor. So, done a really good job. Next slide. But this is kind of what it looks like. Go to the next slide. Oh, back up for a second. Sorry. This is what sampling looks like. So essentially, we pull water out of the ground, we pump it up into these automatic samplers, or we sample it with these in situ devices that are measuring the fluorescence of the water, the optical fluorescence in the water. That's what they're measuring. The witch's brew technically is drinkable, although I never had the guts to drink it. But it is listed as a harmless substance, and it is, food grade dye that's used in all kinds of stuff. But in any case, that's how sampling looks. And we sampled between 4 months and 14 months. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, why we had to go all the way to 14 months. That's kind of interesting. Next. So this is kind of what it looked like. The red flags are our automatic water samplers. And you can see we have samplers distributed all throughout this basin, heavily sampling here at Wakulla, Indian, McBride's. Over here at the St. Mark's River Rise, we got a well here. This is on St. Joe's property. These are USGS well. This is 2 USGS wells, SJ1 and 2. And then here, this was interesting with the nitrate plume. We used the plume map to figure out where we wanted to sample, because we just concluded that, oh, well, wherever the nitrate's the highest, that's where the water from the spray field's going, so that's where we're going to sample. So we sampled all of these wells. The little blue lines are grab sampling that we were collecting either daily or once every couple of days manually. And I'll come back to that later. So we're sampling all along the downstream edge of the spray field. These yellow arrows are where we injected. So we injected 20 kilograms of green dye in each one of these 3 wells, and we injected 60 kilograms of orange dye in this turf pond swallet. And so this is, zoom in, and we did 2 tests. First, actually, that was the second test I talked about. The first test, we injected a red dye, about 5 kilograms in each one of these wells of the 3, each of those 3 wells. So we got red, green, and orange dye. Next slide. So that's where, this is the first injection. January 26, we injected 15 kilograms of the red dye. Next slide. In March 9 of the same year, we came back and injected 20 kilograms per well in the same wells. And then the next one we did on that same day, we injected 60 kilograms of the orange. Next. This was where we got our detections. So we got one and only one dye detection in SE10 along the entire front of the spray field. And we detected all 3 dyes in that one well. So we detected the red from the first, the green from the second, and the orange from the third injection. So the flow path is obviously this way here, but from the orange it's coming way over and flowing that way. SJ1 and 2, we got all 3 dyes, and down here at SJ7 we only got the green and the orange for some reason. Next. At a broader scale, this is what it looked like. We collected a whole lot of samples. We got a lot of positive detections, and this is the distribution of where they look, of what they look like. So we got X's here means no detection. We got detection at SE10. That was our presumed pathway. Comes through. We measured them at SJ1 and 2. And then we drew these lines to show that we got positive detections at Indian, at Sally Ward, at Wakulla. And we got no detections anywhere over here on the St. Marks River or down here at Newport. Next. And this is a different presentation of the data. This is called the breakthrough curve. I call it my $250 million breakthrough curve. I also call it my I don't know anything about business curve, because we got paid about $50,000 to do the dye trace, and I think it was CH2, your company, got paid the rest. So I didn't even get a thank you, but in any case, what we saw is that when you have background concentrations of the dye, or essentially non-detect levels of the dye, and then as the plume comes through your sampling point, it rises to a peak concentration, plateaus for a little bit, and then comes back down afterward. So you can actually learn a tremendous amount about the aquifer behavior by analyzing these breakthrough curves and what their shapes look like. I'm not going to take you through all of that we can learn today, but I will show you something about the timing next. Remember, I had 2 injections. Then an early one and a late one. Next. This is the second injection. And this is the recovery curves at the wells close to the spray field. These are the USGS wells close to the spray field. Next. And this was the first injection. And over here I have days. This is the days after injection. So what's interesting is they're close together, but the second one appears to have traveled faster than the first one. And so initially we thought, oh, there's something about green that moves faster than red, right? Green lights go, red lights stop. That was our initial conclusion. Okay, so next. But then we saw it again down here at Wakulla. Go on. Green, red. And this time the gap is bigger, as you might expect, because the distance was a lot further, but the green dye clearly traveled faster than the red dye. So we're like, wow, why is that? Now let's think about that a little bit more in depth than green, fast, red, slow, and we'll go on to the next. And what we see is that it's related to the water levels in the aquifer. So now, and I'll show it and I'll try to tie it together in the final stage, but at the beginning on our first injection, this is what the water levels were doing when we injected. So this is the time, the date across the bottom where we injected the red dye. Water levels were low. And right after we injected, we got a big rainstorm, series of rainstorms, and a lot of recharge to the aquifer, and water levels shot way up in the aquifer. And when they shot way up, that swalette, that turf pond sink started flowing. So another way to think of it, here was a dry period. The river, turf pond, was not taking any water. There was no water going into the swalette. That's why we didn't do the injection any longer, because we wanted to inject at turf pond. Back in March, we had gotten that big rainstorm. Turf pond was just pouring water into the swalette, so that's when we put our dye in with it. We did the second injection here, and shortly after we did our injection, it stopped raining, the valve turns off, and all the water levels drop way back down to their low, dry conditions. Okay, next. So if we build a schematic on this, this is a schematic, this is a hypothetical schematic showing turf pond, the conduit that goes out to Wakulla Springs, and these lines are the potentiometric surface in the Floridan aquifer showing the flow directions relative to the conduit. So under low water conditions, the conduit is the trough. It's taking all the water, and all the water from the surrounding aquifer is feeding into the conduit, and then the conduit, it picks up velocity in the conduit, and it speeds along its way to the spring. When you have some kind of mechanism that creates high flow into the conduit, like for instance, turf pond starts taking water, the conduit charges, it becomes pressurized. And once it becomes pressurized, this water can't get into it any longer because it's got too much pressure in the conduit. And so all of a sudden this water, it can't go into the conduit, so it slows down, it changes direction, and just stagnates for a while until the dry period returns, the conduit drains, and now the pressure drains out of the conduit, and then flow can return and everything moves quickly. Next slide. This is one of the things that take away that we learned. If we use tracing, our velocities come out between 252 and 2,337 meters per day. I'm sorry, I didn't make my change to feet multiplied by 3, and you get a rough estimate. So basically from about 750 feet per day to over a mile per day are the velocities that were defined by tracing. What are the assumptions relative to that method? 0. Because the dye went in, the dye comes out, we measure the time in between, divide by the distance, we got it. Or distance divided by the time we got it. Pumping test, if we calculate velocities based on pumping test transmissivities, we get 0.03 to 0.23 meters per day. This is based on a gradient and aquifer thickness of about 100 meters. And there's the reference for it. If we look at model-derived transmissivities, we've got 0.03 to 1.17 meters per day. Again, a calculated hydraulic gradient and the aquifer thickness of about 100 meters per day. Hal Davis is a reference. And geochemical age date, if we do that, we come out with somewhere between 7.5 and 15 meters per day. That's based on an age at Wakulla of between 20 and 40 years, assuming that 100% of the recharge is derived from a single source at the top of the basin. And those are the references on those. So what you can see is that unless you do the tracing, unless you pay attention to the conduits, you underestimate the travel time to the aquifer by orders of magnitude, right? Orders of magnitude means multiples of 10. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to take you on, and by the time we got to this point, to 2008, this is now what the Leon Sinks Wakulla cave system looks like. And the divers, my friends, have been super active in the whole basin, explored cave up here at Bird Sink, Natural Bridge, in the Punch Bowl Sink over here, Shepherd Spring. We got cave explored down here at Spring Creek. And these are the totals. You have over a quarter of a million feet of mapped cave passages, 75,000 mapped meters of caves throughout this basin. Now you might say, oh, this is Wakulla, it's unique, oh, the big caves. But might I also throw out to you that if I was smaller, I could have gone farther, right? And I tried to get as small as I could. But if I was smaller, I could have gone farther. There's nothing, just because it's Wakulla, they're big, they're easy, they're accessible, the processes are the same. It's the same rocks, subject to the same gradients, the same types of recharge, the same thing, same, everywhere you go from Tallahassee, from Jackson Blue, all the way to Tampa, all the way through the Mid-Peninsula and all the way around. It's the same processes. And the same thing's going on. Next slide. So now let's I'm going to take you to another trace, little I think much more consequential trace. This one was super consequential for whatever engineering firm that got that contract, but for us, thinking about the Floridan aquifer as a resource for which we depend direly on, I think this trace is much more significant. We wanted to see what's the relationship between Spring Creek and Wakulla. Why did we sample 14 months when we did the trace? Well, because somebody had a vested interest in the possibility that Wakulla might not be the only destination of that water. I won't label who that was, but they came up with enough money to keep us sampling for 14 months, and we sampled predominantly here and here. We didn't find any of the dye that we injected at either of those locations, but what we did see, because we bothered to look, we hadn't been looking, nobody had been looking prior to this, is that every summer since 2006, Spring Creek started to reverse flow. So the largest spring in the state of Florida, some people argue twice as much discharge as Wakulla, shuts off, and then it reverses flow for periods of a month or more during the summers of, during Florida summers since 2006. So that became significant. We really wanted to figure out what was going on. So we decided to try to source the water for Spring Creek through tracing. And here we're going to focus on Lost Creek. And there, basically what we did is we came in and we injected dye. And I said to somebody before, you know, oh my God, it's great you didn't get stuck. And I have held true to this premise my entire life, that it is better to be lucky than good. Okay? So when we injected dye at Lost Creek, Spring Creek was flowing. But 5 days later, Spring Creek reversed. And we just got super lucky because essentially we got dye come out at Spring Creek. It came out in about 5 days. It came out for about 1 day before it stopped because Spring Creek stopped and started reversing. About 40 days later, we got dye at Wakulla Springs. So that dye plume that went into the ground, excuse me, it split. It went to Spring Creek. Part of it probably hung out down here because it got trapped. The rest of it was subject to that reversal. And then it flipped off and it flowed north to Wakulla Springs. So what that did is it definitively showed that Wakulla and Spring Creek are connected by a conduit. Okay, and now my buddies are extremely motivated, and I am extraordinarily confident that one day a human being will swim from Wakulla Springs to Spring Creek. I've swam myself about a quarter of, I don't know, 500 feet from Spring Creek north, and the tunnel is huge and just keeps on going north. But somebody, by the way, at this point, they connected Leon Sinks and Wakulla Springs is the longest cave in North America. They swam from Turner Sink 7 miles along this passage, and they came out at Wakulla Springs. So this trace was super consequential because it told us that these things were connected. And so we wanted to look into this more. I'll go to the next. I'm not going to try to explain this graph to everybody. So, but what I do want to show you is that right about this time, we're talking about minimum flows and levels. Anybody familiar with minimum flows and levels? I have a feeling you are. So minimum flows and levels for Wakulla. But if you look, this green line is the Wakulla discharge curve. And since about 2006, every time we move into the dry summer periods, the green discharge curve jumps up. And it actually gains flow in the dry part of the year. So the management district jumps to the great conclusion that why should we be concerned about flow at Wakulla Springs? There's actually a surplus. Every time we move into drought, magically, Wakulla gets more water. And I'm sitting here going, well, wait a second, guys. You lose the biggest spring in the state of Florida, you know, because of that. There's a relationship. Because the water that used to go to Spring Creek, of course, when Spring Creek shuts down, it flips and it goes to Wakulla Springs. That's what the dye trace showed. So that's why you see these jumps. So every time you see a jump in Wakulla, it's because Spring Creek is shut down. This is a connectivity curve to show you that Spring Creek salinity goes way up. Go on to the next slide. This is the point that I want to make. Remember I showed you Punch Bowl Sink? I bet you didn't. I bet you weren't paying attention when I showed you that on the map. It was a sinkhole about 3 miles inland from the Gulf of Mexico coast. At 3 miles inland, this is what we observe happening, is that whenever Spring Creek shuts down, water level at Punch Bowl jumps up, and so does the salinity. Salinity at Punch Bowl at depth, measured at about 300 feet in the conduit, jumps up to seawater conditions. So essentially what we know definitively, go to the next slide, is that whenever Spring Creek reverses, salt water travels 3 miles through the aquifer and arrives at Punch Bowl sink in as little as 1 to 2 days. Okay, so when you think about the implications here, it's huge. And I'll talk about, I'm going to hold off, I'm going to talk about it again, but that's what Punch Bowl is. Next. Okay, so why is this happening? Well, it couldn't be happening because of pumping, could it? Let's take a look. In reality, it's happening because the hydraulic gradient is getting flatter, right? That slope of that canyon that's driving water to Spring Creek is getting really flat. And it's flattening for 2 reasons. Sea level is going up. We know that sea level is going up. But also because we're pulling water out of the aquifer. So we're pulling it down on the top and we're pushing it up a little bit on the bottom. And as a consequence, what's happening is the springs along the coast, not just Spring Creek, Wekiwa, all of the coastal springs are behaving the same way. They're shutting down their flow as the gradient flattens, and the pumping is a part of it. Let's just look. This red line is we presume the Wakulla Spring Creek springshed to be about half of this red line. Within that red line, there's 93 million gallons a day being pumped out in Georgia, and there's 21 million gallons a day being pumped out in Florida for agricultural use. So that's about 110 million gallons a day. Wakulla's average discharge is 250 million gallons a day. Next. For municipal supply, we got about 54 million gallons a day and 24. So you're looking at about 80 million gallons a day being extracted. That's Wakulla's base flow. It's being extracted for municipal use within that red line. So this is the relationship. So now let's take a quick look, difference between porous media and the karst methodology. So what I want to do now is I want to jump into the central part of Florida and show what's the consequences of the difference between these assumptions. The next slide. All right. All I want to tell you about here is that this is a model. This colored map is the output from a numerical groundwater model simulation. So that's what all the years in school produce, is the ability to make pretty pictures. So this particular pretty picture shows you where the model deviates from observed conditions. That's a nice way of saying it's in error. By the red boxes are more than between 10 and 20 feet. The red stars are between more than 20 feet. The red pluses are 3 to 5 feet. And the blue circles are 5 to 10 feet. So what you see is that you have, if I condense this down, the model is in error by more than 3 feet at about 50% of the wells throughout the model domain, which is the central part of the Suwannee River and Santa Fe River Basin. It's in error by more than 5 feet at 25%, in error by more than 10 feet at 10%, it's error by more than 20 feet at 2% of the wells. Next. This is the kind of consequence. I'm going to jump to silver. This is the kind of consequence. What this base map is a numerical model simulation of travel time. And what the figure producer here has done is they've contoured the model's output such that you can see the predicted 100-year time of travel in the light blue, the 10-year time of travel in the medium blue, and the 2-year time of travel in the dark blue. In 2011, a colleague of mine and some others did a series of dye traces in this region, and they injected a dye here in the 10-year time of travel zone that, it traveled in about 294 to 311 days, 5 miles. It cut out of the 10-year, through the 2-year, and to the springs in less than a year. Let's look way out here. We injected, this one is outside of the 100. It's in the springshed. It's in the model-defined 1,000-year time of travel zone. And it traveled across the 100 and into the 10 to a well in the 10. It took 181 to 194 days. So basically, again, what we're seeing is that those model-defined travel times are missing the mark by orders of magnitude. And this is really consequential because, correct me if I'm wrong, Bob, right now we're dealing with a BMAP process that uses travel time as the basis for vulnerability, an understanding of vulnerability of the springs. And I'm going to say one other thing in a minute about how also it's relevant. Next. So now, this is a model that we were able to build. We actually built this model for Coca-Cola in the Santa Fe River Basin. Real quick, why does Coca-Cola want to build numerical groundwater models, right?
Because they own that one, what's that brand of water?
They did. They decided to get completely out of spring water and ultimately shut down this deal. But they own a spring water bottling plant right next to Ginnie Springs. And as it turns out, Coca-Cola has conducted statistical risk assessments for every one of their water-producing operations, not spring water, but any Coca-Cola, Gatorade, any of them, all over the world. High Springs rose to the top of that risk assessment because of the fact that they felt that the nitrate levels were going to go up, for which they can't treat and maintain it as spring water. They thought that consumption was going to go up, which would threaten their ability to have access to water. And they felt that the methodologies being used by the management entities in this basin were not sufficient to adequately manage the resource because they didn't include karst. So we got the great opportunity to work for 4 years on Coke with the one mandate: build a better mousetrap. And so we went to the shelf of software and we chose a different piece of software, and we used the technologies that have come out since the 1970s, and we built a model that did just that. It includes conduits. These are the residuals, and you have less than a foot at more than 50% of the wells, less than 3 feet at more than 90% of the wells. There are 3 wells that deviate by more than 5 feet and only 1 well that deviates by more than 10. And this was a model that was built to calibrate to both low and high water conditions. The point being that if you choose the different method, if you look for your glasses in the room where you lost them, you can build a much better model. And the model is better by the same objectives that are used to, or objective criteria that are used to measure, to judge all of the models. Next slide. See if I can remember where I'm at. So, click. So here's what I want to say. With the porous media approach, I probably didn't summarize it here. With the porous media approach, let's nail it all the way down. The bottom line is that vulnerability is predicated on the distance between the resource and the source of contamination. It's a simple distance formula. If your well is closer to the coast, is closer to the ocean, then my well is closer to the ocean than his well, my well will get salty before his well as a consequence of saltwater intrusion. If your source of contamination is closer to the spring than his source of contamination, your source will get to the spring faster than his because it's a simple distance relationship. So let's look. What I'm going to do, this is the results of the conduit model. This is the simulated aquifer. And what I'm going to do is what we've chosen to do, this is what Coke was interested in, is to understand which municipalities vis-a-vis which wastewater treatment facilities are most likely to be a threat to Coca-Cola's water bottling facility, which is right here next to Ginnie Springs, right on the Santa Fe River. So what we did is we seed these municipalities with particles, and then we tell the model, tell me where the particle goes and track its path. It's called a particle track. So what we're going to do is I'm going to run those tracks. Bob, click on click on the slide. On the black thing. Yeah, on the image. Okay, so what you're seeing is time clicking off over here. And basically, what you see is that as soon as a particle gets into a conduit, boom, it goes to the spring. It doesn't matter. Notice that, particles that are real close here, this is the High Springs where Coke was most interested in, there's 1,000, there's 10,000 days. So it takes almost 10 to the 5 days before it gets to the river because there's no conduits over there. It's moving through the porous media. On the flip side, bottom line is that Ginnie Springs and Coca-Cola bottling operation are far more vulnerable to things that happen 12 and 20 miles away than they are to things that happen 1 and 5 miles away. Because it's not the distance to the spring, it's the distance to the conduit. How many people have heard about Cedar Key and the water supply wells at Cedar Key? Just recently, what happened there? They got salty. We can't drink salt water. You know what was really fascinating about, there's two things to me fascinating about Cedar Key. Number one, it was not predicted, and it's well within model domains. And number two, it happened overnight. Now go back and think about what I just showed you happens at Spring Creek. 3 miles the salt water travels. And now think about this document. It's not the distance to the coast, it's the distance to the conduit. And so if you've got a water supply well that's 10 miles inland, if it happens to be close to a conduit, if there are water supply wells close to the conduit that feeds water to Wekiwa Springs, when Wekiwa flips, those wells are subject to going under and reversing because of the proximity to that conduit. Next slide. So, what I'm going to start to leave you with is that now bringing it all home, this is Wekiva. I don't know what's happening at Wekiva, but I have no reason to believe that the processes here are substantively different than the processes anywhere else. You're absolutely right. The recharge to the Floridan is on the confining unit. But from what I can tell by reading the reports, the entities and the scientists that have studied it acknowledge that loading to the Floridan is fast. Once the water in the Floridan, that's where my thinking comes into play, comes in. I doubt very sincerely that it's a 105-year travel time through the aquifer, because every time we look, every time we trace, every time we do any of this stuff in the Floridan aquifer, we find that the models and the age dates used to predict those travel times are off by orders of magnitude. I know for a fact that there's a conduit at Wekiva. I remember it. I can tell you as a hydrogeologist that it's nowhere near the same kind of system as Wakulla. We don't see the big troughs, you know, so we don't have swalettes and sinking streams. But what I can say as from my professional career, and I believe, is that you cannot rule out sources of contamination within the basin simply on the basis of distance. In the end of the day, if you go back to the pie chart that Bob showed, there's a distribution of sources of contaminants. And if you want a clean Wekiva Springs, you're going to ultimately have to deal with every one of those. So if you pick off one that says this is 20% of the problem, you focus all your energy into the 40% of the problem or the 50% of the problem, it's unlikely that it's going to fix the problem unless you deal with the rest of them. So I think that if I can convey anything to you here, is that you cannot use the distance as the basis for vulnerability. And what I would also point out is that water always flows down gradient. Doesn't matter what environment it is. This is this is from Toth 2002. This is St. John's River Water Management District publication. This is the springshed, and as delineated in that publication. Bob has spring sheds that are delineated. I showed this one because it has the contours and a little bit different. But, you know, multiple delineations show it slightly different places. But the bottom line is I don't care if it's out here or if it's over here. If it's in the spring shed, it's a source, and you're going to have to deal with it sooner or later. So that's going to the next. So I think I've stated these conclusions. I don't have to go back over them, but karst is prevalent in Florida. Springs are fed by conduits. Every single spring is fed by a conduit. It might not be big enough to drive scooters through and make great videos of, but it's fed by a conduit. Vulnerability, there really are such things as underground rivers. There really are. I don't actually think the witching stick works, though. I tried that. Vulnerability is not necessarily directly related to proximity. Distance to conduits is more important than distance to the spring. It applies to contaminant transport. It also applies to saltwater intrusion. Springs and groundwater are more vulnerable to contamination than have been predicted. This one is one I'm very find myself preaching about. There is probably a lot less water in the Floridan aquifer than has been predicted. Okay. Protecting Wekiva Springs is going to require more stringent regulation on nitrogen discharges, period, and it's very likely going to require reduced consumption of groundwater. This is one that I think is important to point out, though. Protecting Wekiva by itself, if you protect the springs, I don't care if I assume everybody here cares about the springs, but you got to acknowledge that there are some people that don't. But all of us care about the access to groundwater, and access to groundwater as a freshwater resource. If you protect the springs, or if you protect some substantial subset of the springs, both in quantity and quality, you will de facto protect the Floridan aquifer. Let's put it another way. I prophesied that absolutely guaranteed, one by one, municipalities are going to start shifting to surface water because they're going to, groundwater, Floridan aquifer will become not sufficient to meet the supplies. So the question is not whether you have to find an alternative source. It's the only question is when. And well, there's two questions: when and how much are you going to have to replace? If you act soon, if you act now or act soon, you can probably sustain about 50% of your long-term demand for groundwater with the Floridan aquifer. If you don't act at all, you're going to end up with salt water dispersed through most of the Floridan, and you're going to end up with a much larger overall loss in your resource. So I think that that's the overall the takeaway. Last slide. This is how I see the problem. I just Googled some things, and I wanted to see, you know, we all use internet hits as to tell us something about what's the interest level. How many hits are on my blog? How many hits am I looking at? Global water resources, I got 24 million hits. That's a lot. Aquifer protection, 1 million. Water shortage, 8 million. Water crisis, 27 million. Water pollution, 34 million. Bottled water, 10 million hits. Florida Springs, 40 million hits. There's a lot of people interested in Florida Springs. Floridan Springs decline. Not many people know about it. 651,000. Britney Spears, 49 million hits. Free pornography, 188 million hits. Free sex, 366 million hits on the internet. And so if you do some little math, because that's what we do, math, the problem is that the degree to which we care about clean water is apparently only about 10% relative to the degree to which we care about Britney Spears. And it's 68% of how we care about Britney Spears, but only 10% of how much we care about free sex. So if we don't fix this somehow, then all this other stuff is not really going to get left. The last, go ahead. Sorry.
Do we have any questions for Todd?
Yeah.
When you said we're going to go away from using groundwater and perhaps we're going to start using more surface water, what does that mean? Does that mean like giant rain barrels harvesting the water? Does that mean taking water from the lake?
It probably means lakes, rivers, and reservoirs. You know, classic thing that we always do.
Because I was thinking the issue if they were to use giant rain barrels to just collect the water and use that is that then you're still taking away from the aquifer, and then that could create more sinkholes. We're figuring out that's happening.
Yeah, sinkhole's a bit of a problem here, right?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, so intercepting recharge, basically what you're saying is if you intercept recharge, you're kind of doing the same thing. The surface water, I see it as the most pragmatic. It's labels me a lot of times as a non-environmentalist because nobody wants to see the dams and reservoirs on the rivers. But at the end of the day, what I try to point out is that's what we're doing anyway. We're taking that water that would otherwise discharge to the rivers and streams. The fundamental difference is that if you take it from the river and stream, you take it after it discharges. So the groundwater system is not as impacted. The spring ecosystems are not as impacted. The other big difference is every time I fly home, I fly over the great city of lost wages. How many people have lost some wages at Lost Wages? Anybody? No? I'm the only one? Look at that. And when you fly over that city, if you ever fly over it, look out the window. Lake Mead has a big white line all the way around it. And that white line is 100 feet of caliche that marks the drawdown in the lake. If you go to surface water, the impact that you have on your resource is self-evident. Nobody can deny it.
Any other questions?
I'm Russell Bryant. I was swimming at Wekiva Springs this morning at 7 o'clock. I'm a volunteer at Wekiva, and this year at least 8 seniors come and said, "Oh, I can remember when the springs were blue. Well, right now the springs are blue-green, and that's because the only algae control policy if it's a policy, for dealing with algae in the springs is to have people walk in the springs and step on the algae, break it up, and it flows away. I mean, is there any more practical solution to dealing with the nitrogen, the nitrates in the spring, the algae in the springs now instead of some long-term solution?
I'll let Bob answer that question, but personally I think you got to deal with it at the source. So.
Yeah, I mean, you want to take care of the source.
Yeah, want to break it down,
But there's,
throw it away?
well, they're raking algae down at Kings Bay, but I don't recommend it as something that really accomplishes much. There's a big group raking algae in Kings Bay just because to get rid of the unsightly algae. I can't help but think that some of the algae in Wakulla Springs is due to just the recreational impacts of the spring head. In other words, when Dr. Odom went there in the 50s, he recorded that there was submerged aquatic vegetation in there, and the seawall didn't go around the whole spring in the 50s. And I went and studied it, and just the trampling of that spring on weekends eliminates all aquatic vegetation. And then the nitrate probably keeps that aquatic vegetation from growing back also. So I think you're going to have the algae until either you lower the impact, the recreational impact, as well as the nitrate levels there. It's going to probably take both.
Well, the seniors who I talked to say the algae was not originally there when it was born.
No.
And
The algae.
a lot more flow for you. Having higher flow blows the algae out, and the flow has come down significantly in that spring. That's probably part of it too. It's complex, but the one thing that's really changed water quality-wise is the nitrate in that spring, and it's changed a lot. It's like 25, 30 times higher than it was historically, and so
You don't.
controllable. It's totally controllable. It's just a matter of having the resolve to do it, and that's really what we're talking about today. You got to have the resolve to do it.
I'll just throw out that you don't have to be a senior. At least I'm not yet a senior. To remember when it used to be absolutely crystal clear, air clear. That's what was so mesmerizing. Yeah.
I'm not really familiar with that area. I need to become more familiar, but are there old septic tanks? Are there not old septic tanks along the river?
There are.
Yeah.
Right.
Houses that date from 1970.
So would you say, right, I mean, a lot of those septic tanks,
Non-conforming septic tanks. Yeah, and there are also, obviously lots of people in neighborhood where I live, water services and stuff. So,
well, real quick,
there are lots
so
of,
the old septic tanks are leaching into the river as well, right?
Yes.
That's what we're saying.
Yes,
So
new
is that,
ones and old ones, all the septic tanks.
they all are, so is that's Orange County, right?
No, those are private.
Those are private.
What county is that?
Seminole.
Seminole? So along 50 years ago, 60 years ago, when whoever was developing that area, obviously they didn't know what they know now. Is there some way to implement it in the future that either all those folks need to get on a proper storm drain system versus?
Maria, we tried that in the legislature several years ago. We passed the Great Bill, and then there was a party, it was a tea party, came along, and all of that gain was completely washed away because people would have to pay $149 every 5 years to have it again.
If it's fact, if those people are contributing, I don't know how they're not to be held accountable as well.
Well,
Britney Spears factor.
yeah.
And that's why we have this gathering of people to educate Dr. Knight, Dr. Kincaid, the effect on the springs, how water travels underground, so that you can go out. I've seen the Facebook page.
I'm trying to figure out what we can do now, yeah.
You can do that now just by spreading the knowledge. Septic tanks is a problem, but when you look at the total nitrates from septic tanks on that chart, in the study area, it's approximately equivalent to the nitrates from the Water Conserve 2 facility. So we can go to the Water Conserve 2 facility, which is one pipe coming from Orange County in the city of Orlando, and deal with it there, or you can deal with 90,000 homeowners who have septic tanks and tell them you have to pay $10,000 to convert over to sewer. So, which is easier? Let's pick off the low-hanging fruit first. And that's kind of why we've concentrated on it. According to the city, we picked on their water conservation facility. It's like, this is simple, we can do it. Groundwater recharge wetlands, advanced wastewater treatment, we can do this. We can do this, but it's going to take public pressure, it's going to take education, and that's what this is all about. Yes.
My name is Julie. I'm with the Central Florida Sierra Club, and we have been working very strong with all of you and local some politicians to educate them about fertilizer ordinances. And we do have a petition here. You can see me or Kenny here in the Slime Crime t-shirt. And so we're just gathering signatures of support to tell the city that there are people out there that want stronger fertilizer ordinances so that we're able to protect our waters and keep everything clear. So just wanted to throw that out there. If you're interested in signing, come see either of us.
Very good.
We have one.
I have a question. One thing I did get out of this very quickly is the understanding of the conduits.
Yes, ma'am.
So, my question is, do we understand the geology of Florida and where all the conduits are? Because my thinking is, we need to understand that, and if we don't, we need to fund the research for that, because our development should hint on knowledge of this. Like in Marion County, we don't want to permit big nitrogen generating situations like they're doing with Adena Ranch, where it could be, if it's close to a conduit. Here in Orange County, developers and things that can impact our water quality, when you know if it's close or further, can have a big impact, I think, on educating our local, state legislature on yes or no, because how is that going to impact this? But do we know the conduit throughout the whole state? I mean, I know the research that you've done and you've basically mapped out, but...
So the short answer is no. We don't know that. What we do know is that we know the hydrogeology of the state. We know what the rocks are. We know what the hydrogeologic conditions are for recharge, for discharge. We know a lot about the hydrogeology of the state, but no, we don't know where the conduits are. What we hope to do is start to get people to talk to each other. Like, for instance, prior to 2000, there really weren't any substantive state projects. Like, if you said, oh, well, the hydrogeology, or let's look at this study of recharge in this, basin in Wakulla County, they didn't really acknowledge the presence of the caves. And there's some subtle differences there. I put, a lot of blame on the, here today on the assumptions and what's taught in school and da-da-da. But to be fair, there's also because a lot of the people that were mapping caves for the last 20 years, they don't work for the state. They didn't, they keep that data. And then there's this tendency where people, oh, well, I don't want to talk to that cave diver, because how could that cave diver know anything? He's just a lunatic going into a cave anyway, So there's this social gap. So for a couple of years, we tried to focus on that, and I think we did a reasonable job. We got together with the National Association for Cave Diving, the National Speleological Society, Global Underwater Explorers, all the people that I knew and worked with, the entities. We got them together with the Florida Geological Survey, and we established what's called the Florida Cave Database. And if you go online, you can find it. I never got the state to fully accept it, so we built it, but it currently sits on our server. One of these days it'll go out to the state. But it is a library of GIS shapefiles, basically. So if you don't have Esri ArcGIS, it's not going to mean a whole lot to you. But if you are somebody who's conducting studies, someplace throughout the state, you can download the shapefiles, and that will tell you, it won't tell you every single cave that's been mapped, but it'll tell you, I think there's like 56 caves that, we got data for. Most of them are, throughout the Swanee River and North Florida Basin. But that was the first step. And then I think the second step is just to acknowledge, go back to this idea that I said, that there's two different processes, there's two different ways of thinking about the aquifer. If you make the shift from this is a sand to, oh, this is a rock that must have conduits in it, then you can, I think that you can infer a lot of where the conduits must be in order to honor the other objective knowledge that you have. And so I think that we have a long way to go in that regard, but I think that we don't need to find some kind of magic tool that will literally go out and map every single, conduit. We don't need to do dye tracing. The point of our research, again, was to show this is how the process works, and then, the point wasn't to say, oh, you're going to need to go out and do a dye trace everywhere you go. It's to say, if you start thinking about it in this way, you can come up with very different articulations of what the aquifer looks like.
It has to be, you have to educate the people that are not scientists to understand how it impacts, and there's some things that even scientists are teaching that are not correct today. And as a scientist myself on that area, we continually change.
Right.
I think non-scientists, they have a hard time. It's like once you know it, and you don't in science.
Yeah.
But our legislative people don't have a clue. And it sounds like we have got to, as the public, pressure them that we've got to use good science and we have to continue to build on it because that impacts decisions.
By my way of thinking, the changes that I've seen, literally the ability for me to do this work that I presented to you today was driven from the public. It wasn't driven from science. There really were, when I went out and started my own business, it was because I wanted to continue my research, and there was absolutely no hope of getting funding from the National Science Foundation to do it as an academic. And really, as I said, when I would come and talk to people at the state and talk about, oh, hey, I'd like to do this science, remember, there are no such thing as underground rivers. So, the science doesn't necessarily get funded. On the flip side, when I would do public presentations and show, look, we did this dye trace, somebody from this, like for instance from this audience would say, well, why can't you do the same thing at the spray field? Why aren't you applying the same thing that you learn here at the spray field? They pick up the phone, call whoever it is they call, and lo and behold, we have a meeting with Bob Ballard, to discuss, effort to focus on the spray field. So I personally believe very firmly in the power of this public type of interaction, and that the people, the non-scientist people are probably way more powerful than the scientists. So, yes.
One thing I wanted to add, I'm Frank Wekiva, I teach geology at UCF. Actually knew James Stein.
Okay.
Anyway, back about 15, 20 years ago, Sam Upchurch, who at that time was at the University of South Florida, did a study where he analyzed well water and basically used slightly soluble material as indicators of where the water was stagnant. The idea being that in order to have enough, if you had high concentrations of slightly soluble material, that meant it must have been sitting there for a while. So this seems like, since we got wells all over the state, it just seems like those kind of analyses would be an easy way to get a rough idea of where the stagnant water is versus the freely flowing water.
Yeah, I've seen Sam's work, and I agree completely. The model, actually, that model that I presented, where we did the conduit flow paths and all of that, we delineated spring sheds that turned out to be not very different than the spring sheds that Sam had delineated with the geochemical work. So again, I think that it's more about you find what you want to find. If you set out to, if you think that there must be conduits in this aquifer, now let me go and look at the data or collect data and evaluate it in such a way to evolve that line of thinking, then I think, yeah, you'll find them, you'll be able to delineate things. On the flip side, if you believe they don't exist, then you'll find the data to support another story. And on that thought, before I go to the next question, but one of the things that we saw anywhere in the coastal region is that the closer a well is to a conduit, the more of a tidal signature it has. And you see distinct tidal signatures 16 miles inland, near the Wakulla cave system. That's because the well is close to the Wakulla cave. So these days you can buy a pressure transducer for about $500, and you can drop it at any well, and it'll measure the variance. It'll measure head changes or water level changes. And if you plot that variance, if you were able to drop those in a lot of wells and plot the variance, you'll find exactly the same thing as you were talking about with the conductivity. You can use that signal. So there's lots of ways to cheaply get an idea of where the conduits are. You won't be able to drill them, but.
This last January, I had a field trip to Concert 2, and we saw the ribs. And I was told by their staff that they would fill up a rib for 2 weeks, and then they'd turn it off for 2 weeks to let it soak down. So for 2 weeks it would be on, 2 weeks it would be off, each rib. And it looked like the old-fashioned cesspool. It was just sand with a pipe coming into it, nothing else, which we used to call cesspools. And I was surprised that was legal and being encouraged. Also, I asked them, what is your highest nitrate content in your test wells? And he said 7 parts per million at that particular time. And 10 is the limit for a lot of federal mortgage companies. And my neighbor tried to refinance his house years ago, and it was at 11 parts per million. He could not refinance his own house until he stopped fertilizing his lawn for a year and got it down to 9. So keep in mind, all of us could be affected by high nitrate levels underneath our homes if we have wells, and it's in our interest to make sure they don't get ever as high as 10. And just something as simple as fertilizing can affect it. I also asked him, I said, does any of your conserved water come into Lake Wakulla Spring? And he said yes. At least 10% is coming out in Ward Neck Spring. At least. He wouldn't admit to any more than that. And that same meeting, I went to St. John's meeting about Concert 2. And after, in the back of the room, I talked to one of the staff, and he said Concert 2 water is coming out in the spring. They know that. And it's also one of the biggest sources of nutrients to Lake Wakulla. That was off the record in the back of the room.
Yes, sir. What we're talking about, of course, is long range. I'm a short timer. World War II short timer. We've got problems getting our boat on the river because of the problems of the grass on the river. A couple of years ago, they had a harvester out there who did really well. It's easy to pull up if you got the strength and you're free. I don't have either one of them. But in any case, is there some state agency that would help us on a cleanup of the actual Wekiva River that we have today? Not 10 years, 15 years, I know that's the base. But right now, we need some relief. Is there any way? The problem that you have with the spraying is that it drops it down, and the grass and effluent create mud. Mud creates more grass. You get a slowdown of the river. The river can't clear itself. It can't clean itself because it's so clogged. Isn't there any way that we can get some of that, whether you call it alligator gas or hydrogeologist or whatever it is, that we need to get that out?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that. I've worked on the lower Wekiva, and I know exactly what you're talking about. It's partly a reduction in flows, which isn't going to be solved until you turn a lot of the wells off in Orange County. It's partly a problem of a lot of sedimentation from development that's occurred along the river, and most of the inputs, I think, of sediment were from the Little Wekiva River in terms of developing the north side of Orlando. It could be dredged. It would cause a lot of ecological harm to do it. but the state could dredge a channel through there so that you could get boats through there. It'd probably fill back up pretty quickly. So they are dredging other springs. They're dredging the Chassahowitzka Spring right now on the Springs coast.
I mean, we got a beautiful river and we can't use it.
I know what you mean. Yeah, the only way to get down there is in a kayak. Can you do a kayak?
Not at my age, no.
Oh.
Not at my age.
Well, that's one way to get around. We walked across the river there a lot, and because that's about all you could do. So, I mean, long term, for the next generation beyond us, we need to get the flows back in the river. And short term, there's a lot of sediment that's accumulated in that part of the river that some of it could be removed, but it would be more damage to the system also. So, if it's just for navigation of boats, then there could be a boating channel.
We need to get something cleaned out of there.
Well, DEP does that kind of thing. Was there a question?
Okay, so my name's Bill Weinog, and obviously all of us are concerned about the river. I really appreciate you guys coming and talking about what you talked about today. It's obvious we got to do something, and so trying to, there's the study you showed a pie chart that showed where everything's coming from. You said we've got to slow this stuff down at the source, so there's no question we got to slow it down at the source. You talked about the septic problem. We talked about how our legislature got involved years ago. We thought we almost had it. That went away. There's each one of these sources. Some of them we can control. The easy button, which you're chasing, one of the reasons we're here is the conserve. There might be a conduit, might not be a conduit. Bottom line is anything in the spring shed, if the spring shed's right, anything in it, we've got to try to take control over it. There's a bunch of people in houses. There's a thing called the Wekiva Promise where we went out to the people and said, let's promise to try to do something good. And it doesn't work really well because, I mean, sure, education is part of it, but it's not working because, trying to get people to promise to do something good at their house is, like you said, can we take them on? We have to do this through legislature. So I said the thing we've got to do is we've got to go after our friends in government and get them to understand what we're trying to do, because there's got to be laws that change how we act. And that's it. You got fertilizer. We did it with Lake Apopka. Big Ag did that. We're doing the same thing. Commercial fertilizer is how much of the problem? Over a third. We got to go after that. There's got to be legislation there. There's got to be legislations against me and my septic tank. There's got to be, the government's got to be involved to change what we're doing at Conserve too. So the bottom line is we need to talk to our legislators. We need to talk to our government people, get them to understand. Trying to get my neighbor to understand isn't big enough. We got to go after we got to do this through politics.
Huge problem. Unfortunately, we're running into another event here, but in conclusion, and I fully agree with you, in mid-September, you're going to see legislation being proposed. We're helping work on that legislation right now to tackle all those problems. But there are 160 people in the legislature, and there's a governor who can veto it. Right down the street here, we have 6 commissioners, Orange County, 6 commissioners, and the city of Orlando. 12 people could change water conservation. So it would be nice if we all, upstairs, downstairs, could exert a little bit of pressure on a small number of people and change what's going on. Take that from 10 milligrams a liter down to 3. That's all what we want, because it's in, as you said, it's in the Wekiva Basin. And it's a massive amount, 39 million gallons of water per day being dumped in the Wekiva Basin. It's affecting your business. It's affecting our ability to swim in those springs. I would like to thank everybody for coming, and I know it ran a little long, but hopefully everyone got some good information.
Yes, good to see you.